from here through pretty much the rest of this book, we're going to be in David's training for the 10 or 15, some commentaries say 20 years, that David, having been anointed king of Israel, now is going to begin to face a number of tests over the next few years where he will really learn to trust the Lord. And one of the things that I'm excited about as we look at this is that's the story of our lives too. You know, we don't know what the end of the story looks like. And sometimes in the midst of our journey, it looks like we're not going to make it, that the pressures are going to be too much, and we just get tired of always having to be on the run, and nothing seems to settle down in our lives. Well, we learned from David, and one of the words that we're going to see coming up quite a few times in these two chapters, if we get two chapters tonight, is this, that David behaved himself wisely. And I really began to think about that as I've been studying for these messages. What does it look like when a man knows he has a calling on his life, that calling is not yet fulfilled, and everywhere he turns he is facing opposition, not just opposition but outright persecution, running for his life, threatened all the time, living in caves and in the wilderness. And I hope over the next couple of weeks to show you some pictures that I took in Israel, out in the Negev, where he would hide in the desert. Because you walk through places like En-Gedi, which is right down near the Dead Sea, and you're walking down to an oasis, and you're surrounded by these cliffs and mountains on both sides. And it's not unusual to see a cave with as big as the area as those 4 sound absorbers up on the side of the mountain. And they're just all over the place in there. And you think when you walk through here, well, this is where David would hang out. This is where David would have to hide. But for the next 15 or so years, he is going to be a man on the run. And it will begin here in chapter 18. But in every situation that David found himself in, it said he behaved himself wisely. And learning to behave ourselves wisely in any kind of situation is a mark of spiritual maturity and growth. Now, where did David learn that? He probably learned it while he was a shepherd. In the lonely hours out there in the fields, watching those flocks, being picked on by older brothers. Oh, he's just the youngest. He's just a kid. Now we've seen the great story of David and Goliath. And even at that, there's things that were tested in David's life, just in the David and Goliath story. So in chapter 18, verse 1, it says, when he had finished speaking to Saul, that is telling Saul the whole thing about Goliath, probably standing there with a head in his hand while he was telling the story, that it says the soul of Jonathan was knit to the soul of David, and Jonathan loved him as his own soul. Now, later on, it will say that David will say of Jonathan that Jonathan's love was greater than the love of a woman. And so many people take in this, particularly those who have homosexual leanings. Well, this is the case where David had this relationship with Jonathan, but that's not all. Jonathan and David had their souls knitted together because they were like men. And maybe you've experienced it. Somebody told me when I was young, he said, if you go through your entire life and you have men that you can call close friends and you have more than one or two, you're a fortunate man. But you think of a buddy that you have that you just kind of share life. I mean, you do everything together, and there's just this camaraderie, this fellowship that you have. It was sort of like that with me and Byron back in our roommate days. Even though we were like salt and pepper and oil and vinegar, we were so different. But it was just, I mean, we could talk about anything. You know, we had a like mind, and Jonathan was a man of faith, unlike his dad. He was a man of bravery and valor, and I don't know, but maybe as Jonathan was there hearing David tell King Saul about the glory of God and how God had delivered him, the giant, into his hand, maybe that's what caused Jonathan's soul to be knit to David. You know, hearing about his trust in God. Because remember earlier the one story we have about Jonathan? You remember that story? When they were fighting the Philistines and they were trapped, and Jonathan goes to this ragged edge of the camp where only one person could pass through, and he said, God's able to deliver with one or many. Let's just show ourselves to these Philistines. And so he proved himself to be a man that trusted God. Maybe that's what knit him and David together. They had a mutual love for the Lord, and they were both men of faith who trusted the Lord. So this is a friendship that will continue, and David, even after he's king, will remember the oaths that he made with Jonathan and protect Jonathan's children even after he sat on the throne. So Saul took David that day, verse 2, and would not let him go home any more to his father's house. And Jonathan and David made a covenant because he loved him as he loved his own soul. Now think about this for just a minute. Who was the crown prince? If Saul was the king, who was the man who would be taking over the throne when Saul died? I mean, so Jonathan was the heir apparent. The crown was his. But he made a covenant with David because he loved him as he loved his own soul. In verse 4 it says, he took off the robe that was on him and gave it to David, and with his armor, even to his sword and his bow and his belt. And then that probably is a recognition or acknowledgement that he knew David was going to be the king. And when you're in a position where you know that you're going to lose, something that you think is rightfully yours and somebody else is going to claim it, how do you respond to something like that? How do you react? And one of the ways that we're going to see as we look at this story tonight about David behaving himself wisely is that even though he was the anointed king, and even though he knew that the throne would be his, he didn't try to push the issue. And I think Jonathan recognized that in David too. So verse 4, you kind of get this idea that Jonathan probably has recognized that David is going to be king. So David, verse 5, went out wherever Saul sent him and behaved himself wisely. That's the first of several times that we're going to see that David behaved wisely. And you can think about that. David was the anointed king. Saul was still on the throne. David could have said, I'm not doing a thing. I'm just going to wait till that throne is mine. I'm not going to do anything that anybody tells me to do. And yet he submitted himself to Saul and did whatever Saul asked him to do. And Saul set him over the men of war, and he was accepted in the sight of all the people and also in the sight of Saul's servants. I mean, he was a very popular person. And imagine this young man, late teens, maybe 20 or early 20s, now being made a general in Saul's army. Because Saul recognized something in David. And the way he conducted himself when he was out doing the king's business caused not only the people to love David, but it caused the servants of Saul to love David too. And we can stop and make a whole message just on this, Does the way that we live, does the way that I live, is that attractive to people? Or am I like a Saul, who I'm always kind of lowering the boom and angry and yelling? And I can't wait till we get down to verses 10 and 11, where you have a tale of two men here. One had a harp in his hand and one had a javelin in his hand. And Saul was ready to always stick it to somebody, get his point across, in whatever way. And David, on the other hand, was a man with a harp in his hand, which is a picture of a worshiper. We've already seen that with that harp, he brought healing to Saul when he was being tormented with an evil spirit. So David behaved himself wisely. He didn't try to usurp the authority. He waited patiently for the Lord's timing, and he conducted himself in such a way that it was attractive to not only the people of Judah, but the servants of Saul. And isn't that really what Jesus was saying in the Sermon on the Mount when he says, "Let your light so shine before men, that when they see your good works, they'll glorify your Father which is in heaven"? And David here, just conducted himself in an honorable way. There was integrity about him. There was not this sense of self-righteousness. Otherwise, you've been around people like that who think they're that and everything else. Do you like being around those kind of people? That carry some kind of chip on your shoulder, think the world owes them they think the world owes them everything. That's the way they act, and they treat people like, what are you going to do for me? And if David had been acting that way, the people would have rejected him. But there's something about his demeanor that caused it to be attractive to people. And we'll see more about that as we go on. Now, it had happened as they were coming home, when David was returning from the slaughter of the Philistine, that the women had came out of all the cities of Israel, singing and dancing to meet King Saul with tambourines, with joy and musical instruments. And the women sang as they danced and said, "Saul has slain his thousands, and David his 10,000s." You would think that at this point Saul would, he was being recognized as being a warrior, a leader, but yet verse 8 says that Saul was angry. He liked the first verse of the song, but he didn't like the second verse of the song. And he was angry, and the saying displeased him. And he said, "They have ascribed to David 10,000s, and to me they have only ascribed thousands. Now what more can he have but the kingdom?" What do you think was going through the back of the mind of Saul to make him say something like that? Could it be the last visit he had with Samuel the prophet, when he tore Samuel's garment, and Samuel said to Saul, "So God shall tear the kingdom from you and give it to your neighbor who is better than you"? Maybe this is what was, Saul knew it was going to happen, and yet he's trying to hold on to what he has. And then again, as I was looking at that, you and I need to be very careful about being protective and possessive and trying to hold on to what we have when maybe God is wanting to kind of move things around. So Saul was angry. It shows his jealousy. So verse 9 is the beginning now of what's going to be David's time of trial and testing. It says, "From that day forward, Saul eyed David." That is, keep my eye on you. I'm going to watch you. Because he realized that something was going to be happening with David. And so it happened on the next day that the distressing spirit from God came upon Saul. And he prophesied inside the house, which is an interesting kind of mixture of terminology there. But we'll talk a little bit more about that when we get to the the next chapter, maybe not tonight, the last verse of chapter 19, when Saul was among the prophets and began to prophesy. How can you have an evil spirit, a distressing spirit from the Lord, and then turn around and prophesy? Well, y'all can think about that, because we might not get to verse 24 of the next chapter until next week. And then come back and let me know what you think about that. But let me just tell you this. What kind of association can you make between verses 8 and verse 10? The distressing spirit from God came upon Saul. What kind of emotions was Saul expressing in verse 8? Anger, jealousy, comparison. And maybe, do you think maybe some of those things, when we begin to move in those areas, are opening up the doors for demonic oppression? We blow our top. We're harsh in the way we deal with people. And then all of a sudden we feel distressed. And I think sometimes even, we as believers can never be demon possessed. But we can certainly open the door for demonic oppression when we begin to act in the flesh. And Saul was definitely acting in the flesh here, which really makes me think, what's the fruit of me getting angry? What's the fruit of me getting jealous? What's the fruit of me being, when I compare? And even if it's not an oppressing spirit that's demonic, it's just not fun when you get angry. How do you feel when you get angry? Oh man, I'm so excited, I'm so joyful, I'm so mad. The two don't go together, do they? And our joy gets robbed. We get bummed out. We get distressed. We get aggravated. And I think there's a real association between verse 8 and verse 10. And that's why we need to bring our emotions under the lordship of Christ, and instead of lashing out. So a distressing spirit from God came upon Saul, and he prophesied inside the house. So David played the music with his hand at other times, but there was a spear in Saul's hand. Here's the tale of two men now. One is on his way out, one is on his way up. And each have something in their hand. David has in his hand a harp. The harp was used as an instrument of worship, and as some have said, an instrument of healing, because when Saul was distressed, the harp music brought him relief. Yet Saul had in his hand a spear, or some of your translations may say a javelin, and which is always a weapon of war. It's a weapon of attack, always. And I think today you and I are holding something in our hand. Do what we hold in our hand, does it bring worship and healing, or does it bring hurt and war? Many of us hold javelins like anger and harsh words and bitterness that we just throw at someone and get our point across, and have it our way. And we need to be careful, what we're holding and how we use what we hold with other people. And to me, this is a very convicting analogy here, because sometimes our words can be very harsh. And sometimes with our words, we are wounding people, and we're sitting there with that spear, just ready to let it go, let it rip. Just let me at them, and want to get even. And even in the body of Christ, I think we need to need to ask the Lord to put a guard over our mouth, that we don't say things that hurt people. And Saul here, with a spear in his hand, In verse 11, Saul cast the spear, for he said, I'll pin David to the wall. But David escaped his presence. And I left off one word there. Did you notice what the next word was? Twice. Why is that important? Now here I am. I'm trying my best to bring peace and healing to someone, and all they do is lash out against you. They throw their spear. Me, that is in my flesh, I would say, that's it, I'm done. I'm not going to get involved in this anymore. I'm out of here. So not once, but twice. David went right back and Saul again threw the javelin at him. You know, so you begin to see how this man behaves himself wisely. I think there's a little bit of divine intervention in that myself. You know, maybe Saul was so angry he just couldn't see straight. You know, when you get really mad, you begin to see double. You know, your eyes get glassy. Maybe he just saw double and missed. But I think when he threw that spear, God just kind of, knocked it off to the side. Because David, he wasn't out to try to get Saul. And he wasn't going to let this stop him from ministering to Saul. So he escaped his presence twice. Now Saul was afraid of David because the Lord was with him but had departed from Saul. Therefore Saul removed him from his presence and made him captain over 1,000, and he went out and came in before the people. Now why do you think Saul sent him away from the palace and put him in charge of the military? So he can get killed. Let's get the guy. I can't kill him here, so let's send him out. Let the Philistines do it for me. But we see that didn't work either. And here in the second time, in verse 14, it says, David behaved wisely in all his ways, and the Lord was with him. And Saul even saw that he behaved himself very wisely, and he was afraid of him. Now back to this behaving wisely. I don't think David went out as Saul would send him on these missions. And I don't think David went out and said, I can't believe I got kicked out of the palace. I can't believe he's sending me out here to fight these wars while he sits there. I don't believe he was critical of Saul. I don't believe he tried to second guess the whole thing. I believe David at this point had full confidence that the Lord was going to take care of him. Didn't matter what Saul did or didn't do, that the Lord was going to take care of him. And so he behaved himself wisely. I mean, he didn't gossip. He didn't get angry. He didn't try to retaliate. He didn't try to figure things out on his own. He didn't try to, come up with a different plan. He trusted the Lord. And it is easy to see why David was a man after God's own heart. Now, we're not yet into the wilderness part, but the persecution part has begun. And David wrote many of his psalms during this time of persecution and separation. And you can see his heart in some of these psalms as he is being persecuted. But David didn't think it was anything. He just went out and did a good job at what Saul had asked him to do. Saul set him over the military, so David said, I'll be a good soldier. I'll go out there and fight for the king's battles. And because of that, all Israel and Judah loved David because he went out and came in before them. And the way I live my life is either going to attract people or it's going to turn people off. And I want God to work in me in such a way that my life is attractive to people instead of one that is always looking like they're agitated and mad and frustrated because somebody else is not doing what they're supposed to be doing. Does that make sense? And even in a body our size, it's easy to get comfortable, and allow little things to begin to get under our skin, and instead of behaving ourselves wisely and loving people and loving God, we let the little irritants get in. And the prophet will say later on, don't you know it's the little foxes that spoil the vines? And so now David, this is 3 times that we've seen that he behaves himself wisely. And the people love him because of that. Saul recognizes it. And I think it's even more conviction on Saul when he sees the way that David is living his life, because he's not living his life that same way. Now, as we get into the next section of this chapter, remember what the prize was that Saul had offered for the one who killed the giant. Remember what it was? That he could marry his daughter. Well, Saul said to David, here's my older daughter. I'll give her to you as a wife. Only be valiant and fight the Lord's battles. For Saul thought, let my hand not be against him, but let the hand of the Philistine be against him. And then David, in verse 18, kind of responds, what is my life and my family's life that I should be son-in-law to the king? Now, there was a thing back in the Bible days called a dowry. You know what dowry was? Alimony in advance. That a man would have to pay a father a certain amount of money to marry his daughter. And the father would keep that money in case the daughter ever came back home and would live with him. So Saul is a king. And the way the dowry would work is the higher up you were in society, the larger the dowry would be. So David is probably thinking in verse 18, how in the world am I going to pay a dowry? I'm just a commoner. I don't have it. What am I going to do? And so I don't know how that all plays out, but I think that's what's going on in these couple of verses. He's offering him the daughter, but David feels like he can't come up with a dowry. And Saul says, let me just get out of my sight, let the Philistines kill him, and then I don't have to worry about having him a son-in-law. But it happened at that time that Saul's daughter, Merab, which should have been given to David, was given to Adriel, the Malahothite, as a wife. Now Michal, Saul's daughter, loved David. And they told Saul, and the thing pleased him. Let me just tell you that the love that Michal had for David was not the kind of love that would sustain a marriage. The kind of love she had for David was like the rest of Israel had for David. This is a great man. He's a great warrior. She admired the hero part of David. How do I know that? Because when David later on would really want to worship the Lord, she began to ridicule him and mock him and make fun of him. So this is not the kind of love that will sustain a marriage. It's the kind of love that's an infatuation. I really admire this man. And Saul heard about it, and the thing pleased him. Now, I always wondered why his daughter loving David would please Saul. Maybe she knew the kind of girl she really was. I don't know. He said, now I'll get him. He can have her as a wife. Saul said, I'll give her to him, and that way she'll be a snare to him, and the hand of the Philistines may be against him. Therefore Saul sent to David a second time, you'll be my son-in-law today. So I don't know what kind of daughter that she was where Saul thought she would be a snare to David. But again, he's setting David up to be killed by the Philistines. And we know that's not going to happen. So they pass around this story within the palace there, verse 22. Tell David secretly and say, look, the king really delights in you, and all his servants love you. Now therefore become the king's son-in-law. So the guy spoke to David, told him that, and David said, does it seem to you a light thing that a king that I should be a king's son-in-law, seeing that I am a poor and lightly esteemed man. And what was he thinking about there again? How am I going to afford his wife? And the servants of Saul told him in this manner. And then Saul comes up with this brilliant idea. Tell David, the king does not desire any dowry except 100 foreskins of the Philistines to take vengeance on the king's enemies. And of course, Saul thought, that ain't going to happen. Because in order for that to happen, you'd have to have 100 dead Philistines. The history books tell us that the Philistines ridiculed the Jewish people because of the rite of circumcision. And so Saul says, I got it now. I've got this great plan, and we'll see what happens. So when the servants told David these words, it pleased David well to become the king's son-in-law. Now the days had not expired, and David arose and went, he and his men, and killed 200 men of the Philistines. And David brought their foreskins and gave them in full count to the king, that he might become the king's son-in-law. And Saul gave him Michal as his wife. There's a side of David. He walks around carrying the head of Goliath, Look what I got, and brings it to the king. Look here, I killed Goliath. And now he brings this full count of these foreskins in a bag to Saul. Saul has no choice but to give his daughter to David. In verse 28, Saul saw and knew that the Lord was with David, and that Michal, Saul's daughter, loved him. And Saul was still more afraid of David. So Saul became David's enemy continually. Back up in the earlier part of the chapter, it says that Saul kept his eyes on David continually. Now it's progressed to the place where he became David's enemy continually. And this is nothing more than pride and jealousy in his own heart. And the princes of the Philistines went out to war, and so it was, whenever they went out, that David behaved himself more wisely than all the servants of Saul, so that his name became highly esteemed. 4 times in this chapter, David behaved himself wisely. And so that he was highly esteemed. God help me to be wise in the way that I live. Is that something y'all think about or would ask God to work in your life? Lord, let me live in a wise way. And what does that look like to live wisely? In a broader sense, it'd be simply walking with the Lord every day, not seeking my own way, not seeking to sit on the throne of my own life every day, but just to let the Lord have his will and way in my life, however that unfolds. And maybe it will be said of us as the records are written later that they behave themselves wisely. That we don't want to always be out on the offensive against people. And if you don't believe Christians can be nasty, look at what people are saying about Kanye West. Believers are saying about Kanye, and his conversion to Christ. And there's the attacks that are coming from Christians about this man holding these churches and releasing his first gospel album. Greg Laurie had a great message on Kanye's conversion. And, when he has a record entitled Jesus is King, he's getting a message to people that would not normally go into a church. And yet you read some of the anger that's coming out on some of the social media from Christians about Kanye and his conversion. And would we say that's acting wisely? You know, Greg Laurie said, and I kind of agree with it, man, he's getting people to at least talk about Jesus now. You know, and that's a great thing when people begin to talk about Jesus. But Saul would have none of that. You know, Saul was an angry, bitter, hateful, prideful man. David, a man after God's own heart, Saul, according to his own testimony at the end of his life, says, I have played the fool. And so you and I today have a choice that we can make, don't we? You know, I can't control the circumstances in my life, nor can you. Most of us spend a lot of time worrying about things that we have absolutely no control over. We spend a lot of energy and effort with circumstances that are beyond our control. And sometimes because of that, we get angry, we get bitter, we get jealous. We become Sauls. We allow the circumstances that are happening to bring out the worst in us instead of bringing out the best. And I think just a decent prayer that all of us should have is that, Lord, teach me to behave myself wisely, speak kindly to people, prefer people, don't push my own way, make my own path. You know, I don't want to be a self-made man and pull myself up by my own bootstraps like our society teaches today, but let me be a person who lives a life like I genuinely trust in the Lord. And I guarantee you it will make life a lot more pleasant. It may not change our circumstances. It did not change David's circumstances. In fact, they would get worse for the next decade at least. But it didn't change his heart. It only bore out what was in his heart. John Corson says the trials and circumstances of life are like a tube of toothpaste. We get squeezed and you see what comes out. You know, and I don't know, but I want to be a David who behaves myself wisely. I don't want to attack people. I don't want to, whisper things under my breath and, say things that hurt and offend and, get out of my way and leave me alone kind of thing. But just go about life trusting God, loving people, and let God take care of all the others. Chapter 19, which we're probably not going to get really far into tonight, is the beginning of David's real persecution. Now, he hears the story that Jonathan hears the story in verse 1. Saul begins to speak to Jonathan, his son and his servants, that they should kill David. So now it's not just Saul. He wants to tell everybody else, we got to get rid of this guy. And he probably knows that there is a covenant between Jonathan and David. And so Jonathan's, it says, Saul's son delighted greatly in David. And here's the heir apparent. And if he can delight greatly in David, knowing that he's going to replace him as the king, there must have been something in the life of David that was non-intimidating at all to Jonathan. Isn't that a lot like Jesus? Jesus said, a smoking flax or a bruised reed he will not crush. Why don't we stop there? We've got enough to go home and chew on for a little while. 2 words that I think we ought to be thinking about this week is behaving wisely. And let's ask the Lord what that looks like in our lives. And if we're married, maybe ask our spouse what that looks like for us to behave ourselves wisely. Capiche? Good idea? All right, let's pray. Father,